3 days after Russian officials announced the death of Alexei Navalny in prison, his wife, Yulia Navalnaya, released a message to the world.
Продолжать дело Алексея Навального. Продолжать бороться за нашу с вами страну.
A promise posted on her late husband's social media to continue to fight against Vladimir Putin and what she calls a corrupt Russian elite. She's asking Western countries to impose sweeping new sanctions on Russia and to refuse to recognize the country's upcoming election. Some are seeing this as a step towards becoming her husband's successor. So how did she arrive at this moment? And could she actually pose a threat to Putin? Despite Navalnaya's husband's high profile, she led a relatively quiet life for a long time. For over a decade, she was seen at protests and court hearings in Russia, standing by her husband's side, supporting his activism. But she rarely spoke in public. Then, in the summer of 2020, she stepped into the international spotlight for the first time.
Opposition politician Alexei Navalny is in a coma in a Siberian hospital with suspected poisoning.
At first, doctors in Omsk refused to let her see Navalny, so she confronted hospital staff and put pressure on them with camera crews and impromptu press conferences on the hospital steps, demanding over and over that the hospital release Navalny and allow him to be taken to Europe. At one point, she even appealed directly to Putin in an open letter on social media. All of that grabbed the attention of Western leaders who offered to help, and eventually,
oblivious to the political storm around him, Alexei Navalny arriving in Berlin for treatment.
Now the German government says it has proof beyond doubt that he was attacked with the chemical nerve agent Novichok.
a month after being discharged from that Berlin hospital, the couple talked to German media about what happened.
По всей этой истории, если из нее можно извлечь удовольствие.
Navalny said if his wife hadn't mounted that kind of international pressure campaign to get him out, he would have died in that Russian hospital, and authorities would have covered it up. Yulia, you saved me, he wrote on Instagram.
But while he was in this medically induced coma, when he couldn't speak for herself, she was the one who advocated for him. After, when he was recovering, she began doing more interviews with him, taking on a bit of a more public role.
Then, a few months later,
inside the plane that has just landed in Moscow carrying the Putin critic Alexei Navalny.
Navalny was detained by authorities within minutes of stepping foot back on Russian soil, sparking protests across the country.
Free Alexei Navalny, a call that rang out across Russia this Saturday.
And Navalnaya was again back in the spotlight, fighting for her husband's release. She was even detained on live TV while speaking to reporters at one of those protests. Ever since, she's become increasingly visible on the international stage, with a very public appearance at the Oscars last April, telling her husband and over 18 million viewers, "I am dreaming of the day you will be free, and our country will be free. Stay strong, my love." All of that public attention hit a fever pitch last week, under the worst of circumstances.
Shock, outrage, after one of Vladimir Putin's sharpest critics, Russian opposition leader Alexei Navalny, was reported dead in a Russian prison.
I would like to call upon all the international community, all the people in the world. We should come together and we should fight against this evil.
When news of her husband's death was announced last Friday, Navalnaya was in Germany. And in that speech at the Munich Security Conference, she addressed Putin directly.
Я хочу, чтобы Путин, все его окружение, путинские друзья, его правительство знали, что они понесут за то, что они сделали с нашей страной, с моей семьей и с моим мужем ответственность. И этот день наступит очень скоро.
A few days later, she called on Russians to fight with her, promising to topple Putin in her video statement.
Я прошу вас разделить со мной ярость. Ярость, злость, ненависть к тем, кто посмел убить наше будущее.
That same day, Navalnaya was in Brussels, appealing to EU officials.
The bloc's Foreign Affairs Council invited her as they discuss further sanctions against Russia.
During that meeting, she asked for more sanctions against Russia, and that Western leaders not recognize the result of Russia's presidential election next month, saying, according to a transcript of the meeting, a president who assassinated his main political opponent cannot be legitimate by definition.
I think she will try to capitalize on this attention by keeping the momentum of the Navalny organization, which was focused on corruption within the Russian regime.
I wouldn't be surprised to see her in London or in Washington, working to get support, continuing support for the Russian civil society, which is now largely in exile. She's made clear that she would like to see more sanctions on Putin's cronies, on individuals who are enabling the Russian war machine and enabling the Putin regime.
For some, Navalnaya taking up the mantle is a natural progression. Russian journalist and political scientist Yevgeny Albats posted on X, "I always thought politician Alexei Navalny is two people, Yulia and Alexei Navalny."
She has always been his closest advisor and confidant all the way through. Even though she wasn't in the limelight at all, she wasn't taking a front and center position, she was editing and reviewing everything he wrote, and he posted it.
She was part of the team and sitting there at the table having all of these discussions. She won't need sort of a learning curve.
But here's the thing. While Navalnaya's influence in the West may be rising, her impact in Russia is unclear. She no longer lives there, moving to Germany in 2021 after her husband's arrest. So what real power she holds in Russia is difficult to measure.
It is very hard, probably impossible, for a Russian opposition leader to make any inroads with Russian public opinion from abroad. They will be seen as a foreign agent by a significant proportion of the population.
Every time Navalnaya's spoken out since her husband was put in jail, she's come under intense scrutiny in Russia's state-controlled media, with commentators accusing her of cozying up to the West.
You have to understand that Alexei Navalny and Yulia Navalnaya were heads of an organization of devoted activists trying to seek change in Russia. But they're not sort of the replacement for Putin waiting in the wings. They were not that popular.
Navalnaya may be successful in her calls for international sanctions against Putin and the Russia regime, but mounting a real threat to Putin within Russia, that's a much bigger challenge.